Welcome to Italics, television for the Italian-American experience. I'm your host, Anthony Tamburri. On this episode of Italics, our guest is Professor Donna Chirico, Dean of Arts and Sciences, York College, CUNY. Dean Chirico is also president of the not-for-profit foundation Italics, Italian-American Intercultural Alliance. She is, as well, a board member of NOIAO, the National Organization of Italian-American Women. In addition to her numerous roles, Professor Chirico has also chaired the CUNY-wide Italian-American Faculty and Staff Advisory Council to the John D. Calandra Italian-American Institute. As some of you may know, Italian-Americans were designated a protected class back in 1976. Given the intriguing history of Italian-Americans as an affirmative action group within CUNY, we thought we would revisit that history with Dean Chirico. Welcome to Italics, Donna.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Good to be here.
So let's just let our spectators know who you are. You're a Dean of Arts and Letters, but you are also a Professor of Psychology.
Yes, Arts and Sciences.
Arts and Sciences.
I don't want my biology and chemistry people being offended, but I'm a psychologist by training, and I do research on identity development these days, particularly about ethnic identity development and how that interacts and how that contributes to your overall psychological sense of self. And at York College, we don't really have any Italian-American students, but we do have immigrant students who share that experience with Italian-Americans and who are very concerned about how do they integrate their past ethnic lives into the American Ecuadorian experience, American Colombian, American whatever it is. So that's the kind of research I've been working on these days.
Let's revisit just sort of briefly the history of Italians as a protected class. They were designated a protected class in 1976, but there's a history before that that dates back about 15 years or so.
This is very interesting because, as you know, we all just attended a conference in Australia where Italian immigration started later than here in the United States. And in speaking to one of the journalists who was attending the conference, it was fascinating because when I was describing the history of Italian Americans at City University, he said, "Oh, that's what's happening here now in Australia." And essentially, it's what happens is, as new immigrant groups come, groups that had been here begin to be overlooked. And Italian Americans had an unusual situation in that for many years they did not have the educational attainment that is needed to have such positions. Well into the late 1980s, Italian Americans were the third highest dropout group, for example, in New York City high schools. However, they caught up and very quickly began to have the needed degrees, the needed experience, the needed expertise. But by that time, the civil rights movement had taken place, there were newer immigrants coming, and what was shown was there had been systematic discrimination against hiring Italian Americans at the City University. So whether it was malicious or not malicious, it happened. Right? It occurred, and there was a lawsuit, and that lawsuit was won. It goes back to Chancellor Kibbe's memo saying that Italian-American faculty and staff had been overlooked, as well as Italian-American students. And special concern was expressed about Italian-American students having later achievement that, surpassed their parents and grandparents, obviously.
And in fact, just to give some numbers, you mentioned we were the third highest dropout, the group with the third highest dropout rate, which was, I think, something like 22% according
Yes, it was very high.
And now we're the second lowest at only around 8%.
Right. There's been a dramatic change, obviously, overall in dropout rate in New York City high schools, and that's something we always have to factor in when you're discussing such issues. So yes, it's true, the rate has gone down for Italian Americans, but it's gone down for everybody.
Right. But let's also complicate that issue just a little bit, because I think the numbers that are used are for public schools and not necessarily for Catholic schools.
Yes.
And I say Catholic as opposed to private just because of the history of Italians sending their sons and daughters, especially their daughters, to Catholic schools.
Yes, this is true. It's only used for public schools, and in fact, it gets even more complicated because that's also true at the college level. So when you're looking at certain kinds of data, diversity data, you really have to dig a little bit deeper sometimes to look at the private colleges who don't necessarily have to reveal that information to everyone, especially since Italian Americans are not a protected class outside the CUNY system. They're not a protected class in the SUNY system either.
No.
I mean, this is a very unique circumstance here.
It dates back to the 60s and 70s, but it was solidified finally in the early 90s with the lawsuit.
Yes,
We
absolutely.
can call it the historical lawsuit that solidified the Calandra Institute as well. I think
Yes.
as an institute in New York City, that is in Manhattan, as opposed to any of the other boroughs and with any of the other colleges.
And the council was created much earlier than the 1990s, because when Chancellor Kibbe had written that memo, he said that there needed to be representatives on each of the CUNY campuses who could then be the eyes and ears and be in communication about this issue. And then once the lawsuit took place, then the council became an advisory unit to the Calandra Institute. And then the same thing occurred, so that we have representation from all the campuses. And we meet and we discuss issues on the campuses, and we discuss the present day circumstances that continue, not just for Italian Americans, but for other groups at CUNY.
So what are the present day
The present day circumstances are actually quite remarkable if one recognizes that we live in the most diverse city, and that the City University of New York has an incredibly diverse student population, that in the last 4 years, since they've begun to take very serious steps toward rectifying the lack of diversity among faculty and staff, that the numbers of diverse faculty and staff have actually gone down at the City University. So this continues to be a problem. I mean, in 2012, the City University published basically an action plan about rectifying some of these matters. And then last year, the CUNY Board of Trustees, when it saw that this action plan hadn't accomplished anything, they took a very strong stance about wanting to see the data and wanting to see quarterly reports about what's happening with regard to hiring for faculty and staff. And so far, none of these initiatives have really turned things around. I mean, Italian Americans currently stand usually somewhere between 5.2%, 5.4% of the faculty and staff. It shifts a little bit. But for example, in the last 5 years, the number of Black or African American faculty hasn't changed a bit. So it's been 12%. It's been 12% for years, and despite recruitment and other plans, nothing has changed. And that's also true for Puerto Rican groups. It's true for other groups as well within the City University.
So, but we do know that this year CUNY has made an extra push. That is, presidents, if I'm not mistaken, the presidents of the various colleges now have the option to engage in a what can we say, to use a phrase that was once CUNY's target of opportunity hire, where they recognize a significantly underutilized group and that they look to hire a qualified person from that group for whatever discipline, whatever department might need faculty and staff and things of that sort.
There are several things going on. The targeted hiring, the opportunities hiring are very important. They're cluster hires. And there have also been changes to the protocols in and around searches, the way searches are done. There are new trainings going on. There are diversity town halls going on. However, one has to remember that when a search committee gets together, the tendency is that the search committee hires somebody like them. So when you have these cluster hirings, the challenge is, all right, will we increase diversity, or will we simply hire 5 more people like us? So this is something that is being discussed very carefully. And that's why the procedures had to be changed simultaneous to the demand to increase diversity, because it's an issue. Faculty come in, they look at degrees, they look at what a person's research is. I'd like to work with somebody, so I want somebody who has my research. So maybe that's not the person of diversity. Or despite the accolades that City University has achieved through the years, somehow when we see Harvard on a CV, this impresses people. And it shouldn't.
Yeah. That's for another show. Public-private universities. So what about utilization? Because this is a word that people don't necessarily, use on a daily basis, right? There used to be other words, the Q word and the R word, which we can't use anymore.
Right.
But we use utilization.
Well, and it's tricky too, because utilization really comes down to, do you have the representation of a particular group that reflects what's available in the workforce, right? And the problem with that is when you have a search committee, this is not clear to them either. And very often at a campus, it's not clear. We think of the federal groups that are listed on the census, for example, and those are the groups that people tend to think are the ones that are underutilized. And sometimes you have to really take a careful look. I mean, on my campus, for example, we have a good representation of female faculty, right? So, but folks look at it and assume it's not. So you have to kind of carefully take a look at your campus and say, where is it that we lack for diversity? Where is it that we lack for role models for our students? I mean, it's a bigger issue. That's why diversity is so critical.
Yeah, and for Italian Americans, we think that the workforce, the labor work pool, or whatever it's called, workforce labor pool, is somewhere around 14% maybe.
Yes.
But unfortunately, we're at 5%.
That's correct.
Yeah, and we should be at around, what, 9 maybe? We'd be content at 9?
I would be content at higher than 9, but if you want to go with, I mean, the reality is it hasn't changed in 20 years.
Indeed, it has changed, but it's gone down.
Yes, but that's correct. So when this whole process started of the recognition, it was a little bit higher, but there has been no substantial change in the representation of Italian Americans within the workforce at City University. And when people quibble with you saying, oh, it went from 5.0 to 5.3, there's no point to that quibbling.
But there are other challenges, right, to that. I mean, we live in New York City. It's one of the most expensive areas around. And while you can live in a place like Indiana, where some of us have lived, and you're offered $60,000, $65,000, it sounds wonderful because your house will only cost you about $150,000. But of course, in the greater New York metropolitan area, it's much more challenging. And there's that challenge, I think we have to say.
It's a very big challenge because not only it's a challenge at many levels. Because for the person who's going to be offered the job, it's a big challenge because it has to do with not just your house, but of course if you have a family, and can your partner find a position, and transportation. I mean, the person may or may not be able to live near the college where they're being hired. I mean, it's one thing to find a less expensive apartment in the Queens area, and even that's getting hard, but if you live, here in Manhattan and you're working at Hunter College on the Upper East Side, you're not going to find a place at the $65,000 salary.
No, unfortunately
But it poses a challenge at many levels. There are many things also we don't pay for here at City University that are taken for granted at other colleges, even public ones. For example, being able to fly somebody in for an interview. Right? We place many restrictions on that. So you may have a very good candidate who for this year is abroad teaching somewhere, but we won't pay for them to come in for an interview. So there are a lot of things linked to the reality of budgets that affect it. But salary is a big one because everything is so expensive here in New York City, and it's very different than living in other places.
Yeah. Let's talk about curriculum and Italian American Studies. We visited this, you and I, and Fred Gardafe, who's our distinguished professor of English and Italian American Studies. We visited this, I think, in 2014.
I believe
we had a conversation. In 4 years, how have things changed? What have you seen changing in 4 years?
Again, not much has changed. The matter of ethnic studies is one that's very interesting at large, right, to the general population because we have such diversity in the United States, in New York City, and students are very interested in this. And there are many ethnic programs for other groups that they've pushed for, but the idea of an Italian American Studies program only exists in a couple of spots. I think Lehman is one of them. Is it Italian American Studies?
Lehman has still on the books, but it's not active. An Italian American Studies major at the undergraduate level,
Right.
and actually it's the only major that I know of in the country. But unfortunately, it's not active. And then there's minor at Brooklyn College, which I think is active. There are some faculty between the Italian studies faculty and our colleagues such as Robert Viscusi. There are things going on at Brooklyn. Yeah.
But the reality is, you know, other than that, it's a smattering of courses.
Right.
And if someone really wanted to pursue this, even for the sake of what I study, which is creating your own identity, it would be impossible at most of the CUNY units. Ironically, my unit is one that has a course in this, where, as I said, we don't have Italian American students, yet the course is always full, right, because of the idea of identification and ethnicity. But there needs to be a way for students to pursue this ideal if they would like it. And not just at the undergraduate level, it really needs to be at the master's level. Or not necessarily a doctorate in Italian American Studies, but certainly a way that somebody pursuing a doctorate in certain areas could take this as a chunk in their doctorate and be able to take a series of courses that would really inform them of what's going on in the field and how to pursue it and why it's important as well.
Yeah. Fred Gardefei and I at Queens College have put up 4 courses a number of years, about 3-4 years ago, were approved at the graduate level. So we have 4 courses at the graduate level in Italian American Studies, basically literature, cinema, and then what we call problematics, which is a look at the sort of history of Italian Americans, also in relationship to other ethnic groups. Which actually one of our colleagues did many years ago, a book on that, named Steven Steinberg, called The Ethnic Myth. And that's a really wonderful book because it deals with ethnic groups, comparisons of ethnic groups, and actually I think he has 2 chapters that actually has Italian or Italians or Italian Americans in the title, and that's good. So we have that, but it's at Queens College, and it's not CUNY-wide.
Right.
And that's sort of been a challenge for us. It seems that Italian American Studies exists according to whoever is in loco. And Fred and I, for years, have been in one place and been on dissertation committees, Fred more than I, at other universities, and not only in the United States, but also in Italy. So it seems that it remains to be a challenge here.
Well, but you bring up an important point, because if anything is to change, it has to start from the top, because of the rules and regulations at City University, because of curriculum procedures, if you're talking about a degree program, because of the nature of hiring of the people who are going to do the hiring. So unless you have the support fully of those who oversee all of these various aspects, you are not going to see change. And we have the evidence that that has been the case. And for curriculum, it's extremely challenging because in addition to having people who might advocate the curriculum, you have these very odd curriculum practices at colleges where it takes forever to get a course through. If it's not linked maybe to general education, maybe people won't take it. So that these days there are challenges in and around getting students to take electives. And some of those are financial, by the way, because if you look at some of the newer regulations in and around financial aid, there's not room for students to take electives. So there are many things one has to overcome to be able to do this.
Yeah, because there's a push not only for 4 years now, which maybe 40 years ago was the norm, but not anymore. But also our students. We need also to think about our students at CUNY, because our students at CUNY, for the most part, commute, number 1, and number 2, work part-time, if not some of them full-time, right? So it's difficult to finish in 4 years, number 1, and number 2, it's just difficult to take those extra classes. So there is that, the idea of finishing in 4 years, and there's also the issue of if you take, I think, more than 130 or 140 credits, you're then penalized. It costs you more, or you can't do it.
There are lots of penalties these days if you don't stick within the 15 per semester and the 120 credits, and you lose your basically you're going to lose your financial aid. So if you don't do it within the 120, that's it. It's based on semesters, but if you didn't do your 120 credits in the 8 semesters, it's gone too. I mean, that's the state aid. There's still federal aid they can get. But nonetheless, it's difficult for students when they're being told, oh, you only can take your major and you can only take general education, so that we're really diminishing the breadth of knowledge that students come out with. And we're, interestingly, limiting their sense of diversity, because they don't have the opportunity to study others and look at it in a systematic way. And so, you know, therefore they come out and they're diminished in some sense because they didn't have those opportunities.
Now, I wanted to call your college, your division, arts and letters, but it's arts and sciences. You straddle both fields, really, because you're not a practicing psychologist.
That's correct.
You're more of a theoretician, let's say, right? You're engaged in critical writing, you engage in whatever, historical writing, theoretical writing about your field and about the various groups, et cetera. It seems there's an upswing in the humanities. From reading, you know, I'm one of those people, I think like you are, who gets the Chronicle and looks through the Chronicle and, you know, gets it online, whatever, and takes a look at those articles. And it seems that there's now an upswing in the humanities, or am I wrong?
No, I think that you know, it always depends on who you read.
Yeah.
But I think that what we see is, you know, there was this push for a very long time about skills, and students should come out with a set of skills for a particular job. Well, that's just a ridiculous idea. Because skills themselves are not transferable usually from one job to another, but the issue has to do with critical thinking, critical reading, critical writing, and understanding of numbers, right? A literacy about numbers, not just about reading. And there's a growing understanding that the place where this happens is in the humanities. It doesn't happen in, you know, the accounting course you're taking necessarily, unless you have a really brilliant teacher, and it doesn't happen in some of the health courses you're taking to become a nurse or a physician assistant, but it's the foundational courses in the humanities that really engender the real skills you need to succeed at any job. Right? Because once you can do that, you can then figure out what happens. And I think that's why we're seeing a little bit of growth. And if not majoring, certainly we're seeing a growth in minors. So a person may major in business, but they understand that it's a good thing to also minor in English or minor in a language, right? So that they can have that as well.
Yeah. So back to Italian American Studies. Should we be hopeful?
I think we have to be hopeful because there's no other way to be. But I think that there are enough of us who are interested in it. A little bit about the history of the course at York. The course we have at York is the Italian experience in the United States. This course had not been offered for 20 years. And when I became the dean and said I want to still teach, I resurrected the course. And the first semester I taught it, people were asking to get into the class even though there was no room in the class. And I don't teach it every semester because of my other obligations, but someone else said, oh, I'd like to teach it. So he taught it the next semester. Then I taught it the following semester. Now this semester we have 2 sections of the course. We have 60 students at York College taking a course in the Italian experience in the United States.
And how many of the students are Italian American?
And none of those students are Italian American.
And that's a good thing.
Yes, extremely.
That's a very good thing, right? Because those students now become, acquire knowledge about an ethnic group that they know only through mediatic stereotypes.
Right. Yeah. And we offer a series of courses like this on different ethnic groups. And when I ask my students, why are you here? They say they want to learn about immigration, they want to learn about the ethnic group, but I have one student in particular who's gone out of her way to take as many of these ethnic courses as she can. Which is very interesting because she said she's going to be a social worker. And she feels in New York City it's important to know about the different groups and as you said, what's the real story about them? Because when students look at the pictures of Italian Americans when they first came, when they hear the stories of what they went through, they suddenly realize, oh, wait a minute, it's not just everything I see on television or in the movies, it's very different. And, you know, they read Christ in Concrete, for example, which is the story of every immigrant in some sense. So they begin to realize, oh, look, this is just what my family went through. And oh, yes, of course there's discrimination. And of course it's challenging when your name is unpronounceable for the rest of the United States. And it becomes a very big issue for them. And so they enjoy the class, they do incredible things in the class, but always relating the Italian experience to their own ethnic experience.
You also send them out to do field work, quote unquote. Not really, but you send them out to events, don't you?
They must attend 2 cultural events. Yeah. Now, you just mentioned that our students work and they also have families, so if they want to, there's a list of films they can watch and they can use for only one of the papers,
okay.
Right? Other than that, you know, they have to go out into the world. So here are these, you know, Black and Latino and Middle Eastern students showing up at the Calandra Institute
exactly.
to attend events, and they come back and they say it was a great time and they learned so much, but I've had students go to the anniversary events for the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire where they were moved to tears when they saw what happened. I've had them go all over the place, you know, to places where they would have never gone before. And one assignment they all must do is the Tenement Museum. Okay. In Lower Manhattan, because they don't have to go there, because the Tenement Museum has a great website and you could take almost like it's a virtual tour.
Virtual visit.
And there's something, they call it a game, where you create an immigrant and then you go through the immigrant experience, but about a third of the students do go, and when they come back, they're not the same. Right? They suddenly say, oh wait, 30 people in this room?
Yeah.
And it suddenly becomes very real to them of what immigrants went through, you know, in the early part of the 20th century.
It's wonderful that they're doing it at that level, that is in the undergraduate level, because I think that precisely because of the whole notion of stereotypes. I mean, I don't get excited, you know, about the stereotypes. I just think that we sort of, okay, another one, and we deal with it, but we are that culture, right? So we know that that's not the main representation of Italian Americans, but it is important for other people to know that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do save the topic of the mafia to the end of the semester.
There you go. So while they're all well informed about everything else.
They know everything else first, but then I have a student who comes from the former Soviet Union, and very early on she did tell me that her mafia was stronger than our mafia.
There you go.
And the idea that, of course, every country
has
something similar, right?
Yeah. I want to thank you for spending time with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for watching this episode of Italics. I'm Anthony Tamburri. Arrivederci alla prossima puntata.